Good evening. This is the Ecology Hour on KZYX 88.1 Fort Bragg, 90.7 Philo, 91.5 Willits and Ukiah, Mendocino County's public and community radio, and it is 7 p.m. If you were a rancher trying to raise sheep or cattle and were losing your stock to predation by wildlife, what would you do? What resources are there available to help somebody in that situation? Is killing the predator the only way, and in fact, is it even a useful response? And how do your actions have a knock-on effect on our ecosystem? Well, those are some of the questions that we are planning to explore on this evening's Ecology Hour. We have tried to reach out to a number of different groups to get different views on this topic, which is of particular interest in Mendocino County right now, as our own county considers the future of a relationship with Wildlife Services, a federally supported assistance program for ranchers and others who are having wildlife conflicts on their land. We are going to speak with a number of people this evening, including Devin Jones, the Executive Director of Mendocino County Farm Bureau, John Bailey, the Director at the University of California Hopland Research and Extension Center, Camilla Fox, the Founder and Executive Director of Project Coyote, Kyle Farmer from the Magruder Ranch, and Alex McInturff, a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. There was so much to cover in tonight's program that I do want to let our listeners know that in fact we will be adding to the program in next month's edition of the Ecology Hour. Please do make sure that you try and listen in for that show as well, because this show really is added to greatly by the information that comes from that ecological point of view. Hopefully these voices will help us to navigate what is an exceedingly complicated problem. Well, let's get started in tonight's show. Given that we have so much to cover, we're going to start our conversations with Devin Jones, the Executive Director of the Mendocino County Farm Bureau. I started by asking Devin for a background on how ranchers have used the resources available through Mendocino County to assist with wildlife conflicts.
So basically some background. Our county has had some form of agreement dealing with wildlife management or predator control since 1919. And interestingly enough, when we had our centennial celebration last year, going back through our documents from 1918 and 1919, Farm Bureau has always been in support of that program in some way, shape, or form for the last 100 years. I mean, the reasons why have transitioned a bit, but the support for that program has been consistent. Where it's at currently is since 1989, roughly, the county of Mendocino has had an agreement of some form with the Wildlife Services Program, which is administered through the United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA, and that plan, had been renewed incrementally over the years until roughly, I think it was around 2015 or 2016. So in that time frame, there was litigation that was filed by a number of parties against the county and the related contract with Wildlife Services, specifically related to the CEQA documentation, the California Environmental Quality Act. So where it's been now, there's been a number of settlement agreements in that 2016-2015 time frame. And currently where the county of Mendocino is at is they are working. They've suspended their contract for the Integrated Wildlife Damage Management Program, IWDM for short, with Wildlife Services. And they're working on moving forward with the development of an environmental impact report related to that program. From about April of 2016 through roughly October of last year, 2018, there was some limited services that were being provided independent of the county through the USDA Wildlife Services program. However, that funding mechanism was no longer available past October of 2018. So since that point, we have not had any representation actively engaged in Mendocino County. So that's kind of left a void in certain scenarios.
Yeah, I don't want to rush you, because that was a wonderful review of what is a long and complicated history of this subject, and goes back way before that too. I wonder if you could give us an understanding of what were the range of services that Wildlife Services or the IWDM that you mentioned would have been called upon to assist with?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And so a lot of the times this program gets labeled as simply predator control and only for the ranching community, which is definitely not the case. That is part of it, but it's not the full extent of the program. A number of issues that come up throughout the county that we've worked with individuals on have to do with sort of public health types of scenarios where people have called here with sightings of raccoons or possums primarily out in the middle of the day, and there's been concern about rabies. We've had issues significantly in the urban areas of the county just related to that interaction with wildlife. I've got raccoons in my attic, or I've got raccoons under my house, or fill in the blank on other species there. We've also had one species that people overlook a lot of the times that does cause havoc throughout the county, not just for farming or ranching scenarios, but also just for rural residential folks or those people that are dealing with water quality and erosion concerns, and that's wild pigs. We have a significant wild pig population here in Mendocino County, and Wildlife Services over the years has worked with a number of individuals on trying to advise them on ways to deal with those issues as well. So it's not just about the livestock industry and predator control. There's a bigger picture to that integrated wildlife damage management program.
Well, I'm interested. So, for example, I'm guessing that right now you frequently get the calls from folks saying, I've got a raccoon stuck in my attic or whatever it is. And in that situation, you would have referred them to Wildlife Services. Is that correct?
Correct.
And Wildlife Services would have gone and maybe used a number of different methods. I'm guessing that there wasn't, I think frequently when we talk about this, we imagine that every single time there is any kind of issue with a wildlife species that they are killed, and that isn't necessarily the case. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, just think about the scope of our county, and this is something that's really important to remember. Our county is a very large county compared to some more urbanized counties, and it's significant in size, and where we only had 2 employees working in the entire county as of last year when the program sort of stopped. The first thing a lot of these sort of contacts have to do over the phone. So a lot of times we would take phone numbers or other relevant information and provide that either directly to the Wildlife Services employees or provide the contact to the individual that called us. And, they would do the outreach first for technical advice. So, getting more information. So, for example, if it's, a larger species like bears, a lot of times we've had urban residential folks call us about, hey, I'm having a problem with a bear in my garden, a bear in my orchard, a bear is breaking into my outbuilding. So Wildlife Services would, contact them, try to get some additional information, how often has it been happening, what are the specifics, and then they would provide, some technical assistance, either over the phone or they would, arrange to go out there in person. They might also consult with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, depending upon their workload, to kind of outreach those individuals and decide, sort of determine a plan of action per se. But yes, you're right. Any sort of, trapping or, lethal option isn't the first recommendation.
Having said that, and I do think that that is an important point to have made, on occasion, a lethal method is what would have been employed. And I think that's one of the things that, certainly creates a lot of concern in our community and has done to a much wider level too. In your experience working with ranchers, is this a major problem for them? Is it a major problem for them that they are struggling now not to have those services provided? And what tools do you see them using now that they are in this situation?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on, if specifically to livestock operations, it really depends upon the species of interest. So, there's different, proactive management strategies that are easier to use for smaller livestock species like sheep or goats versus cattle. So we have seen a lot of effort to look at non-lethal means of just improved management. So a lot of it has to do with fencing, right? So improved fencing, checking fencing for sheep and goats primarily, especially during certain times of the years. When they're having young of the year, especially. People have been advised to bring those animals closer in to an actual sort of barn type of facility. So they'll do like night penning. It's a popular practice. So they'll bring, if they have the facilities available, they will bring the animals in closer to a occupied dwelling or an enclosure in the evening. That's typically where you're seeing most of the predation happen. So that's been something that's been encouraged. I mean, individuals have also looked into electric fencing or flagery, which is hanging tape from electric types of fencing or non-electrified fencing to try to discourage or use scare tactics for certain species. Those have been popular. For beef cattle, it's a little bit more of a challenge just simply because it's a larger animal, typically covering a larger, pasture or range type of a scenario. But similar practices can be made, looking at, specific times of the year for calving, etc. Mm-hmm. Livestock and guard animals have been implemented, again, primarily for, sheep, I would say, or, maybe goats. Mm-hmm. And, those species vary from, dogs to llamas to donkeys. And there's been some success there, but there's, challenges that come up with those practices as well, depending upon your location.
And it sounds like it's a very complicated decision that a rancher has to make about, well, which tools am I going to use? And one of those tools right now, the opportunity to be calling wildlife services, is not available to them. Do you see them kind of moving in a particular direction of how they are handling the situation?
Yeah, so I guess kind of the comment that we've consistently had in regards to the process involved with wildlife services and where we're at in the program the last few years has been, we need as many tools in the toolbox as possible. You may not always use them, but at least you have the option of having them there. Mm-hmm. So, basically what that means is, sure, these farmers and ranchers can take, proactive action to look at their existing management, work on improving that if possible, or trying different tactics, from the non-lethal perspective. Mm-hmm. However, having wildlife services available has been an assistance just simply because of the fact of, the training and the access that those specific staff have when it comes to determining, lethal options, whether mm-hmm. that's, trapping, whether that's the direct use of a firearm, what may be it, they have, some different options available to them, whereas the typical rancher would not. Mm-hmm. And one of the concerns that we have had, and, obviously not having statistics, is the fact that looking at other areas of the state that have gone through sort of a similar conversation of whether to continue with or to discontinue their wildlife services program, you've seen some instances where the ranching community has sort of taken it into their own hands to deal with predation control. Mm. And, that's most likely going to continue to happen. The issue with that might be that they're not targeting the specific animal of concern that is creating the problem with their livestock. Wildlife Services does try different tactics if possible to only target those animals that are actually involved in the issue with livestock. So, having sort of more of a discriminate approach to that might actually reduce and less lethal action versus if you just have, kind of a no option available for no one to talk to, more animals that are thought to be the problem animals that aren't in terms of predators.
And it's very hard to get any sense of what those numbers might look like because, of course, everybody is keeping very quiet, right, in that area.
Yeah. There are some statistics that were brought forward, in the draft environmental impact report from a few weeks ago that, referenced the Marin County program, and they do have some statistics that supported that concept, showing that, based on the numbers that the Wildlife Services program had provided to them and sort of the incremental numbers that were being reported through cooperative extension after the program was terminated, there seemed to be, some increases in the number of predators that were targeted, specifically just within the ranching community. So it's hard to tell, but there is some anecdotal information that supports that.
So, Devin, I obviously we could talk for a long time about this, and I really appreciate how concise and how much you've expressed the situation. Just to finish off with, though, you mentioned that you've just input comments for the Mendocino County Farm Bureau as the county's gone through the process for the EIR. Can I ask what did the Mendocino County Farm Bureau? What were the comments that were key comments?
Sure. So it was a 900-plus page document to read through, so it was pretty thorough in terms of, the comments. But, I guess really that the basic, borderline comment was that, we continue to support, the county moving forward with what they labeled as the proposed project, and that consists of the approval of the Integrated Wildlife Damage Management Program and the related cooperative service agreement with the Wildlife Services California office, and that's to help with wildlife damage management for the county. So that was the basis of, continuing to support that program and continuing to have, those tools in the toolbox of, both non-lethal technical assistance and or, lethal assistance when necessary. And again, that was not just for the ranching community. This is also for the rural residents. This is for property owners. This is for the full, gamut of the residents of Mendocino County that might use this program in one way, shape, or form.
Great. Thank you so much for expressing all of that to us, and we look forward to speaking with you again on the future editions of the Ecology Hour.
Well, thanks so much for including us in the conversation. We appreciate it.
Let's shift a little bit now, and we're going to hear how that actually feels on the ground from UC Hopland Research and Extension Center Director John Bailey. I started by asking John what methods were used at the UC Hopland Research and Extension Center when dealing with predation on the sheep flock, and how are they informed by the scientific research which is conducted there?
I guess overall where we're at is that we're being more careful and selective in how we deal with predators in relation to sheep than perhaps was the case in the past. There's definitely been a long history of serious use of lethal control across the landscape of the whole United States, and that really lessened starting in the 1970s. So here on Hopland, on the research center, originally there were basically no mountain lions or black bears and very few coyotes when the center was founded in the early 1950s. But then as predator control lessened, we started to get more of those predators on the landscape. And in the early years of the center, standard operating procedures were much more lethal, and many more coyotes were removed every year, and occasionally mountain lions were. And so then in, I would say, the mid-2000s, maybe closer to 2010, 2012, the flock size here was reduced, and pulled back from some of the upper pastures where there's greater populations of especially black bears and mountain lions. So we kind of reduced our size and footprint and moved out of some of those pastures where we're having more losses due to predation in an attempt to somewhat avoid them. And they're not that great at pastures anyway. They're not that productive. But then more recently, starting in about 2015 or 16, we really started to develop a tighter standard operating procedure around particularly coyotes, where we, I guess you would say, became more of reactive instead of proactive about removing predators. The research has really shown with a lot of predators, especially with coyotes, that there will be an alpha male and female, and if those don't prey on sheep, then the rest of the pack won't. And so if you go in and you remove those that are non-predatory on sheep, alpha pairs, you can actually set up more breeding within the pack and disrupt all of the population dynamics, where you then end up having more predation on your sheep. So what we tried to do with going into a reactive footing is, instead of killing off any coyote that we saw that was near the sheep, it's only after we get attacked that we will then react with lethal force. Mm-hmm. And we use plenty of other tools to try to avoid that. Mm-hmm. So for example, we have more large guard dogs. We keep the sheep in tighter groups. We move them between pastures more frequently. And we've been testing out other newer devices like fox lights, which are randomly flashing devices that you put in a field to simulate a human out there, and e-collars, which are kind of motion sensitive electronic collars that go around the neck of sheep. And then when they run, which is usually in response to a predator, they will flash and give off a noise and scare away the predator that way. So we've really been refining and working with those SOPs to try to reduce the wildlife losses and keep our sheep losses in control. And we've had great success. I mean, over the last 3 to 4 years, I think we've averaged about 2% loss of our sheep, and have cut the number of coyotes that are removed by about 3/4.
Gosh, so that brings me to a question actually that I know I've heard in the community recently. HREC has reduced its flock size significantly, down from maybe 500 ewes to
125.
Okay, so a big decrease. Now, is that a cut in the flock size due to predator relations and the problems that they've been having, or is there something else underpinning that?
No, not at all related to predators. I mean, actually, in the last couple of years, we've had more losses of sheep due to internal parasites or unknown illnesses than we have to predators. And it was really forced by budget. Basically, the UC system is cutting our budget by 30% from 2 years ago to 4 years in the future. And so they are taking away the funding for our shepherd position and reducing the money that we have for overall operations pretty significantly. So, we really didn't want to or have any reason to reduce down the numbers of sheep, other than we just do not have the personnel or the money to support them.
Well, thanks for clarifying that.
Sure. And, actually, I've heard firsthand and secondhand comments saying, well, I guess your predator control program wasn't working and that these non-lethal methods don't work. And I think that's a total misstatement, that we have been having good success with these methods and have no reason to move away from them. We're continuing to use these methods. So I just want to clear that up, because it's a perception that I've heard out there that's just unfounded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm glad that you have shared that. The other thing I wanted to ask, so the UC Hopland Research and Extension Center kind of occupies an interesting niche, because you're not just a regular ranch, you also have the research going on, and you also have a service to provide to the community to be trying out tools that perhaps the average rancher might not be able to put out the initial outlay for without having some confidence that it was going to work. So some of these newer tools that you were talking about, do you have research associated with them, or ways that you're hoping to share that with the ranching community so they can understand how they could use them?
Yes, I mean, we have an ongoing project. I think we're in our 3rd, maybe 4th year of a non-lethal predator control research project, really assessing these tools. and looking at kind of the overall SOPs that we use, as well as individual devices like the Fox lights, for example. And we regularly conduct workshops on the work that's happening here. Last year, we had one that focused almost exclusively on coyotes and sheep. And then this past June, we had another workshop that was all around sheep techniques, a broad range of them, from guard dogs to herding dogs to breeding to medications. And in that, we had a component on the non-lethal predator control we use. We're looking forward to doing more of that in the future and kind of broadening the focus of these workshops from not just specifically the sheep and coyote interaction, but kind of looking at maybe more in general, how are humans and wildlife interacting in the North Coast region around all kinds of different crops and agricultural operations.
So the other thing that's come clear to me talking with you is this is a really complex area to navigate. And how do you come to the point where you make decisions about how to protect your animals while respecting the wildlife here? Is there a committee or any group that you look to gain advice from?
Well, I mean, it's a definitely difficult subject, and it's not just difficult from the science side, but also from the political side. People are very wedded to their opinions in terms of how they think that predators should be handled. I think it's one of the more emotional topics that comes up around here, and really, though, the science that I've read and that I hear at the workshops where we have different speakers come to is that lethal methods have been very heavily overused, and in many cases have actually led to worse predation after the use. So what we do here to make decisions is, we look at the circumstances on the ground. I work with our staff here. We look at what the peer-reviewed research is out there, and then we have researchers who are on site that we also are in close communication with, and that's part of why we have these SOPs, is that to do research here, you have to have set management tools, or you have too many variables, and you can't get clear answers. And so what we do then is we have an animal care and use committee that is a mixture of people. I mean, there's people from the sheep industry, there's researchers that are on it, there's people who are in vet med and animal science from UC Davis, there's local staff members. And so what we do is we take questions to that committee and then discuss what's going on here, what the research is, what best practices are, and then refine the SOPs based on that.
So, John, at this point, we're going to be talking with some other ranchers and other groups through the interviews today. But I'm interested, do you see any changes that you think you'll be making in the tools that you're using now and the SOPs that you use now? I mean, it seems like it's been quite a changeable area in the last few years. So
yeah, I mean, with the dramatic change of our sheep flock size by reducing it by about 80%, we're really in a period of reassessment. Now if we lose one sheep, we're losing almost 1% of our flock. So we have to reassess kind of the fragility of our flock. We are going to be using less pastures, and so we have a chance to kind of select the less dangerous, closer into headquarters pastures. And we need to do that just from a risk point of view and from a labor management point of view. And then we're also working on developing cattle leases for some of the outer pastures. And we're definitely going to have to do an assessment of how we handle the SOPs around private producers. There's all kinds of UC policies around the use of firearms and different lethal techniques or non-lethal techniques. So what we are going to be really doing is carefully communicating with the researchers that we have on site so we don't disrupt those relationships, because our primary mission is research. But then at the same time, we'll have to look at kind of the practical on-the-ground reality. So I don't really have a clear answer of like exactly what's going to change, but that there's multiple changes going on at the same time that we'll have to manage our way through. But we'll keep the SOPs that we currently have as the core of anything moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much for giving me that time, and we'll look forward to hearing about some of the events that are coming up at HREC to share that information with people.
Great, and I will be curious to hear this interview and all the other people on it as well.
Well, thank you to John for giving us a view from on the ground and some of the research which is actually out there to support in the decisions which are being made. You are listening to the Ecology Hour on KZYX, and I will be your host this evening, Hannah Bird. We are considering the very tricky discussion to be had around how we can successfully ranch in an area which is also rich in predators and recognize the value of those predators in our ecosystems. We are now going to speak with Camilla Fox, the founder and executive director of Project Coyote. And we started straight away with a question about the concerns surrounding the use of wildlife services. We have already heard a little on this show from Mendocino County Farm Bureau about the work of wildlife services. It's been made clear that they've been called on by the county for assistance to many residents, including for domestic problems, for example with raccoons in somebody's attic or something, and then all the way through to working with ranchers who are having problems with larger predators. It's also been made clear that while lethal methods are used in some situations, they aim to begin with education and non-lethal methods where possible. Can you help express a little bit why Project Coyote has concerns with the use of this federal program to assist with wildlife-human conflicts?
Well, first, I would imagine that some of your listeners may not be aware of what this agency is about, Wildlife Services. So just to give a little bit of background, this is a federal agency under USDA. It was established in 1931 under the Animal Damage Control Act. And essentially what they do is provide conflict mitigation for ranchers primarily. And over the years, that has focused on generally lethal methods. Just this past year, their data came out showing that they killed close to 2 million animals, and again, largely at the behest of ranchers. The problems that we see with the agency, and it's not just Project Coyote, but multiple organizations, scientists, is the emphasis with indiscriminate lethal tools. And these include neck snares, leg hold traps, M44, sodium cyanide, poison ejectors, aerial gunning. So what the science has shown is that this kind of indiscriminate killing really is not even effective, particularly for species like coyotes that can rebound very quickly. That's the science, but the ethics of removing so many animals on the landscape, native wild animals that we know are so important ecologically, the ethics component has really come up in debate over the last 10 or 15 years. Very recently, there was a large expose in the Sacramento Bee looking in depth at this agency and really revealing some of the deep problems. And these problems include a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability. I think it's important for your listeners to know, I mentioned the close to 1.5 million animals killed this last year by the agency. Just in Mendocino alone, between 1997 and 2017, Wildlife Services trappers killed almost 200 mountain lions, more than 250 black bear, more than 230 gray foxes, more than 100 bobcats, and over 4,000 coyotes. And again, that was in Mendocino alone. So coming back to your question about our concerns with the agency, it's this emphasis on lethal control. And I will say that they give a lot of lip service to non-lethal, but the data shows differently. And the data, when we have done FOIA's Freedom of Information Act requests, it has shown that very often and most frequently they're actually using lethal very often before non-lethal. And even some of the ranchers that I speak to who have used their services say that the first thing that they do after they look at the situation is set a neck snare. And this neck snare is supposed to ostensibly kill a coyote, but again, it's an indiscriminate device. And what we also know through the data, through these FOIAs, is that very, very frequently non-target animals are caught. And I'm not trying to point fingers at ranchers and farmers, because as an organization, we work with ranchers and farmers across the nation. And I think an increasing number of farmers and ranchers are realizing that this indiscriminate killing is actually not helping them. Because, for example, a coyote family, just like all predators, coyotes are territorial. So they will essentially keep out other coyotes from an area, a family group of coyotes. When that family group is disrupted, so for example, if one of those generally there's an alpha pair with a family group and coyotes, if one of those alpha pairs is removed through snaring or poisoning, that is not only opening up a vacant niche, but it's disrupting the behavioral carrying capacity, if you will, of the group. Mm-hmm. And so that can lead to other juveniles coming in, emigrating from around, filling in that vacant niche. And what we know is that often juvenile predators, whether coyotes or mountain lions, are the ones that are more predisposed towards alternative prey. Mm-hmm. So they are the ones who will seek livestock.
I'm really interested in hearing a little bit from you because, as you pointed out, you do try and work with ranchers. What tools would be possible for them to use that may not have these impacts on the wildlife population?
Yeah, so there's a whole variety of non-lethal tools, and some of them are ancient. For example, livestock guard animals, such as guard dogs, llamas, and alpacas. Guard dogs were used historically in Turkey, parts of Europe, for thousands of years to mitigate conflicts between sheep ranchers and wolves and other predators, and very effectively. So they are being brought back into the U.S. We see an increasing number of ranchers using Great Pyrenees, Anatolian Shepherds, other guard dogs that have been proven to be very effective. I mentioned llamas and alpacas. They have been used historically in South America, Central America, again, to mitigate conflicts and really to bond with the sheep. People are often surprised to learn that llamas and alpacas will be quite protective of sheep, particularly in the face of coyotes and other canines, and they can get very, very aggressive. So they're tremendous guard animals. And I will also say that, with guard dogs, training is very important. So that's another element that we try to bring. Project Coyote, working with ranchers and different ag departments, is having workshops for, what are the most appropriate non-lethal methods, because I will say human-wildlife conflicts are so contextual. If there's anything that we've learned in the last 50 years is that one method that helps solve a human-wildlife conflict over here may not be entirely appropriate over in this other county or other state. So we have to look at the context of conflicts, and that gets down to the ranch. And that's why we believe these going out, assessing what the problems are, and then really deciding what is the best toolkit to help that rancher. And coming back to methods, I mentioned the guard animals, also things like night corrals, where you bring in, particularly during lambing season, you bring in the sheep and the lambs when they're most vulnerable. That has proven to be very effective. Also, new devices such as disruptive stimuli-based deterrents, such as Foxlights came up with this little device that basically goes on the top of a T-post, and the idea is it is light activated, so it comes on at dawn and dusk, and the random lights that are quite bright can very effectively help reduce conflicts, and they're being used all over across the globe, from species ranging from snow leopards in Nepal to elephants, crop-raiding elephants in India.
Gosh.
So we're excited about this device.
It's fascinating to hear what a broad array of tools that there are. And I think, again, many of us just aren't aware of all the things that are needed to be used. And as you pointed out, ranchers often may need to use multiple different methods or change those methods. I do want to allow just a little bit of time. For example, in Marin County, they no longer contract with Wildlife Services. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, Marin County ended their contract in 2000, and I just want to mention the reason they did was because there was tremendous controversy over Wildlife Services' use of poisons, denning, which is the killing of coyote and fox pups in their den, and other lethal methods. So that's why the county ultimately severed their contract.
So at this point, they really are not using lethal methods. And I know the concern that that was raised with the Farm Bureau was that are we getting reflective data from that county now? Because our ranchers possibly in a situation where they don't have somebody to reach out to for help, and they end up perhaps what is called shoot, shovel, and shut up. So disposing of the animals themselves, the wildlife, in a way that really may not be appropriate. Can I ask, do you have any comment on that?
Well, I do. I think it's important your listeners know, and it's interesting that the Farm Bureau representative didn't mention what was adopted by the Marin County supervisors. So what the supervisors did when they ended that contract was they decided to put the monies that normally went to pay that federal trapper towards a cost-share non-lethal program, new program developed by the Marin County Ag Department. And basically that program took the monies that previously went to pay this trapper and helps and assists ranchers with implementing non-lethal methods through this cost-share program. So basically, ranchers in Marin can adopt livestock guard dogs, llamas, and night corrals, the fox lights that they just recently incorporated into this program, and they can get some assistance with implementation of those non-lethal methods, which they previously didn't get under the Wildlife Services program. And that's one of our concerns, is that the Wildlife Services program really puts the subsidy behind the lethal tools, not behind the non-lethal. They don't subsidize guard dogs, llamas, better fencing, night corrals. That is all expected to be the responsibility of the rancher. But Marin's program actually helps subsidize those non-lethal methods. And what we've seen is more and more ranchers who are adopting livestock guard dogs. I think it's increased 50-fold. Llamas, better fencing. So all these methods are now available to ranchers in Marin County. And they just, as I mentioned, it's adaptive in nature. And then to address your question, we've heard this before, this claim that now there's more shoot, shovel, and shut up. And my response to that is to say, well, that's not giving a lot of trust in the ranchers. You're basically saying that the ranchers out there are killing a bunch of predators, and they're not being honest about it. You know, I wonder where they get that information from. Are the ranchers telling the Farm Bureau that they're shoot, shoveling, and shut up? If so, I think, that's very interesting information that would be valuable for counties to have. But I actually think what's going on here is I think it's a subtle attempt to undermine non-lethal methods and programs like the Marin program that threaten our federal government. USDA Wildlife Services, when Marin County adopted this program, they were very threatened. And I should say that Marin County offered to continue to maintain that contract if Wildlife Services agreed to not use poisons, which was the controversy in Marin County, and to only use lethal methods as a last resort. But Wildlife Services refused to do that. They refused to abide by our county's modest guidelines. And so because of that, the Board of Supervisors opted to end that contract and to instead adopt this non-lethal program. I also want to just mention that previously, and in every single county where Wildlife Services operates, that doesn't preclude ranchers from killing offending predators at their own hands. So to claim that somehow there's no data now about predators that are being killed by ranchers, whereas previously there was before, that's simply not true. Ranchers under the Wildlife Services program still can control wildlife on their own private ranches. But the difference now in Marin is that the assistance that they get is actually with effective non-lethal tools instead of indiscriminate snares, poison, and other lethal methods.
Thank you so much for expressing all the tools that are available out there now. That's really helped to provide another layer to the discussion. Camilla, I know we have a very short amount of time now, but I did just want to bring up, we talk a lot about the conflict so far in this program, and I wanted to recognize as well that in many ways ranchers are actually working alongside wildlife. I wondered if you had any stories that you might share with us that will help us to see that side of things.
Absolutely. I mean, we see an increasing number of ranchers across the West, even on the East Coast. We're national, so we're working with farmers and ranchers across the nation. I see more and more ranchers recognizing that there's actually value having predators on their farms and ranchers. They recognize that they're great rodent controllers, for example, coyotes and foxes and bobcats, and that by maintaining these predators and ensuring that they're not being indiscriminately killed, and then these young juvenile problem animals are coming in. They're recognizing that that is a better way, and so they're wanting to have the non-lethal tools and the training to learn how to effectively use those. So we see that across the board. Marin, Sonoma, Mendocino, they're all over California. There is a small grassroots group that has formed in Mendocino. It's called the Mendocino Non-Lethal Wildlife Alliance. They are hosting a free public event on September 18th with me and Project Coyote Science Advisory Board member Dr. Robert Crabtree, who is an expert in coyotes and predators. That will be September 18th at the Casper Community Center. There's more information on Project Coyote's website. But this is just one step of what we believe is needed for the community for Mendocino, because we do cohabitate with wildlife, both in urban areas and in agricultural areas. And we need to learn the best tools and methods for how we can live peacefully with our wild neighbors.
Well, thank you to Camilla for helping to express some of the concerns that people do have about using a system such as Wildlife Services and some of the other options that might be available to help using non-lethal methods to protect our stock. We're now going to move to actually speak with a rancher in Mendocino County. That is Kyle Farmer of the Magruder Ranch. I think this is a voice which is very important in tonight's conversation. There are so many views on this and so many attitudes towards it, but ultimately these ranchers are providing us with our food, and we are asking a great deal of them in making the best decisions, both for our food, the health of our food, and also for the health of our ecosystems. I started by asking Kyle how he went about making these very complex decisions in the midst of all of the conversation which is currently going on.
My name is Kyle Farmer, and I'm the multi-species diplomat at Magruder Ranch.
Very good. I like it. That's definitely the person I need to interview today.
I think the first thing for me is that if the only animals that lived on our ranch are the ones we were raising, I probably wouldn't be doing this for a living. You know, I don't think I'm alone as a rancher that it's because of my love of wildlife that I choose to spend all my time up in the hills. And so I think that it's easy to get drawn into these abstract debates, but it often, as soon as you kind of dive into a particular place, a lot of times the questions get just a lot easier, and the context gets more real, and it can be informed by the science being produced in other places. But the questions, once they're kind of reframed from the direction of how do you live in these places that really nobody knows how to control. So sometimes I think we get lost pretending to make decisions we can't really make. And as long as I kind of just keep my head in the game where I'm trying to make the decisions that are within my power, which ultimately the longer you spend trying to manage rangeland, the more you realize how few of those there actually are. You kind of get humbled either way. So I find it kind of a fun philosophical question that it's really important that we all be looking at right now. We can try to retreat and live in a fantasy sort of post-material decoupled world where the food that we live on is produced in what used to be the Amazon rainforest, or we can engage with these questions and find some better ways to do it.
And I think that's such a good point, Kyle, because ultimately, sometimes I think people feel that they're removed from this conversation, but really, you're growing our food. And every one of us who has an interest in eating has an interest in this as a topic and the decisions made around it.
There's, even if I'm not the one growing someone's food, and even if they're not even meat, they might be trying to live off of Impossible Burgers, but about 37% of those soybean biomass is then going to animals after they're harvested. We're not living off of soybean shells, but we are living off of animals that are eating soybean shells. So the whole thing is just so connected. And that's what ecology teaches us. And yet we often kind of leave ecology in our mudroom and pretend we can just kind of dust off our boots and leave ecology outside our home. But
that brings me...
That's the debate that's going to happen, and that's why this whole it's kind of fun from my perspective.
I am interested. You said each situation is very kind of specific, and for you, we've talked a lot about wildlife services in the show tonight, and we've talked about the options that did give to ranchers, or the possible assistance that gave to ranchers. I'm interested, from your point of view, have things changed much for you now that that is not an option for you right now to be using in Mendocino County?
I have never asked for help from wildlife services.
So can I ask then?
It's a shame because they're probably better at doing what they do than I am. There are professionals, and there's a very reasonable debate about what more can they be doing, what more can other organizations be doing.
Yeah.
I think it'd be really easy to just have a kind of like when I just called you and had to dial an extension. What if you dialed 1 for a volunteer organization that was going to help in one way, and 2 for wildlife services, and just let it happen that way.
And let people make the choice.
They're good at their job. I mean, not everybody would want to have their job, but they're great at their job.
So can I ask, when you do have a situation, and maybe we haven't expressed, Kyle, can you tell me a little bit about the farm that you have and what you have on the land?
So we raise mostly cattle, and for the time being, the only predator large enough to be causing problems for our cattle tend to be domestic dogs. We could be having mountain lion losses that I'm not aware of, but that is one of the things that I kind of view as something that the expense that I would take at really trying to change that would be much larger than the return on investment, which gets to a kind of larger philosophical question about what can and can't you do when you're managing large ecosystems. And I very well might be wrong about that, but an animal that kind of sneaks up and takes a single animal isn't the same as a group of domestic dogs that run the animals pretty ragged. So
you have had problems. Domestic dogs is something you have had problems with.
Definitely.
Okay.
And that's something that Wildlife Services would be an excellent partner in dealing with.
Yeah.
Because they are professionals and I'm an amateur there.
So when
in the sheep, we actually have managed to not see any predation that we were going to choose to do anything lethal about this year. We really tightened our lambing season and actually night penned for 1 month. A little extra labor, but it was a fun job that I could do with the family to bring them back in each night and put them in a pen, an electric fence, and that seemed to do the trick. So it could obviously be different next year, and I think we also just kind of got lucky in the dynamics of the wildlife flush of available food for the coyotes in the spring, and our lambing season this year was pretty well tied to that, and I do think that made a difference as well.
It's interesting to hear you talk in those terms, because it makes me recognize that as a rancher you need not only to know a lot about your own animals and their own the cycles that you're going through with them, but you also need to understand the cycles of the wildlife that you're sharing the landscape with. So is that something you've spent some time understanding?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the ground squirrels will tell you if there's a rattlesnake around, and a turkey vulture will tell you if you had an animal die. So they're sort of partners in the whole management process as well. I'm paying attention. If the badgers come back, then they might be burying calves that die, and I'll never even find out about them because the turkey vultures won't tell me. So, they're all talking to you in some way if you can figure out how to listen.
So, can you guide us through when you do have a situation where you know that you may be losing animals? What's the process that you follow to figure out your best course of action?
My first course of action would be if we were losing lambs would be to change paddocks, and as big a paddock shift as possible. And a kind of a retreat into the more of the core home area, We have a lot of dogs, border collies. We have guard dogs. And the guard dogs are, they're not only defending on the level that we experience, they're defending on sort of a territorial level with other canines. I really think that they're doing a lot just when they're peeing on trees. And so we try to claim the area closest to the houses, which is where our sheep are, because at this point, the main purpose of our sheep are to graze the nooks and crannies for fire grazing close to our house, while we figure out how to be professional enough sheep farmers to be able to scale up and not go broke. So at this point, we do have that option to kind of retreat to the core. Yeah. But even at a larger scale, I do think that night pinning could be an option. And the paddock shift, and the bigger the paddock shift, the better. If I'm lucky enough to be out there and be armed and notice something happening, I will definitely take that option. And that's not an option that we will have in California with wolves. And that would be a very emotional thing to have to do. With coyotes, that is an option.
Yeah. So Kyle, I know all the interviews this evening I've had to keep very short, and of course with every single person I wish I could have had a whole hour just discussing with them. I would like to just make the point and allow you also to raise awareness of the meat that you are producing. I don't know if people can get that in their local stores, but I'd love you to have the chance to plug it. And I think in doing so, I also want to recognize that, you are making decisions which are difficult. And us as consumers should put a value on that. And that may be an important part of this decision-making right the way through, that it's not just ranchers who are making decisions, but it's the folks who are choosing where they get their meat from. So would you mind giving us a plug?
Yeah, of course. It depends on where you are in the county. The co-op is a good place. Harvest Market is a good place. There's also we try to work with as many restaurants as we can. And if I try to list them on this one, and I apologize to that one, but it's right now in terms of Mendocino County, we're in Palico Roadhouse out in Philo, Cafe Beaujolais in Mendocino, Golden Pig in Hopland, as well as Campa Vida in Hopland. Like I said, I was going to forget one or two. Diavola, you'll sometimes be able to find our meat there. And then that other one that I'm forgetting. And then also, I love selling quarters, what they used to call locker beef. It's a fun way to learn how to cook a whole half of an animal, or a half of an animal. Yeah. And I think that's just the best way to get your food. Not to say the other ones aren't as well, but any of our customers, we're always happy to have them out. And even if they think I'm doing something wrong, I'd love to have that discussion with them.
Yeah. For folks who are interested in that option of maybe buying a larger amount from you like that, or how's a good way to get a hold of you or to find out more about Magruder meat? We do have a website, and you can also sometimes watch owls on that website from a wildlife perspective. I mean, there's a lot of other animals that are eating the animals that are eating the grass, as opposed to eating the animals that are eating the animals. So it's a whole, there's a bunch of them out there. And so you can check out those, and you can see some other pictures we've caught around the ranch, and a list of some of the plants and animals we've found here. But Magruder Ranch, MAGRUDER ranch.com. Perfect. And then there's a contact on there, and then hopefully they could just come out. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. And thanks for the work and the thought that you put into ranching, because we're all aware that it's not an easy job, and you do an incredible job at it. Well, thank you. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much to Kyle. I think it helps a great deal to get that on-the-ground experience and knowledge from the ranchers who are dealing with these issues every day. We're going to finish off tonight's Ecology Hour with an interview with Alex McInturff, a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management. I started by asking Alex if he would give us an overview of the history of large carnivores in California.
Yeah, you asked at a really good time. I was actually just at the UC Berkeley Museum of Vertebrate Zoology looking at some of their collections of grizzly bears. And you probably know when you look at the California golden bear pictured on there, which is a subspecies of grizzly, that is no longer in existence. So it's a kind of a good emblem of the history of carnivores in California, because like many carnivores, it was wiped out, or many others were pushed close to the brink over the years. And that was done in a systematic way through efforts of private individuals, through state and federal policies that rewarded the removal of large predators. And a lot of that was done to basically facilitate the development of agriculture, of just the development of California. You can imagine how much more difficult it would be to have the economy that we have now if the place were crawling with the same number of predators that it once was. We like to, in some of the talks we give, we like to cite Sir Francis Drake's journal, where he, was sailing by Drake's Beach and looked at the coast and saw some of these very same California golden bears just roaming the beach, popping out of whales' carcasses that they were scavenging on the coast, and decided, I better not land here. So there's a long history, of removing carnivores, large predators, for the sake of development in California, but that history sort of changes over the past 40 or 50 years. So starting in the 1960s and 1970s, the so-called golden age of environmental policy, a lot of things started to change, both at the legal level, but also in the cultural level. People started sympathizing or coming to respect or identify with large predators, and looking at efforts to conserve them after this long period of decline. Some of those efforts were enshrined into law. There's been a series of laws that kind of continue to get passed, even up to the last few years, that basically have offered more and more protection to predators on the landscape. And sometimes ecologists like to take a little bit of credit for that, because of some of the research we've done on trophic cascades that have identified the importance of large predators to ecosystems as a whole. So sorry, that was a lot to get through. Parallel histories here between cultural acceptance of large predators, legal protection of them, and the science, a history of science that demonstrates their importance to the landscape.
So thank you for managing to do that in such a short period of time. I think one thing I would like to consider, so I want to ask you about your research specifically, but one thing that's come up in the conversations we've had tonight is some discussion about, theoretically, it sounds as if you're a rancher and you have a problem, say with a coyote, and it's been eating your animals, whatever they may be, it seems like you might say, well, the best thing to do is just to be killing all the coyotes. If I get rid of the coyotes, then the problem will decrease. But what we've been hearing from a couple of the voices tonight is, in fact, what can happen if you remove some of the alpha members of the pack, that it kind of creates turmoil, and then you end up with some of the younger animals coming in who are more likely to be killing your stock rather than choosing other prey. Can you help us out as a researcher to understand some of the complexities in a situation like that?
I can do my best. I can give you the really short answer, which is that it's complicated and there's a lot left for us to learn. But I can give you the much longer answer too, which is has to do with what we do know. And as I was mentioning, and I think as the history of California and a lot of the Western U.S. shows, that if you really successfully get rid of all the large predators that pose a risk to you as a livestock producer, then that does in fact make the landscape safer for you. However, there are thresholds above which you have to be able to do that. So, for example, there's research that was conducted at the Hopland Research and Extension Center by former director Robert Tim, And he basically showed that to effectively limit the amount of predation of livestock by coyotes, you have to reduce annually the population of coyotes by 70%. Now, we talked about this history when there were concerted efforts by both individuals and the state to remove predators. There was a time in which that was possible, and it was done. Coyote populations were kept very low, and the risks they posed to livestock were, in fact, reduced. But like we've been saying, you know, there are more protections on coyotes and other large predators now. There are likely neighbors who are more sympathetic to coyotes, who are living next to sheep producers who may be unsympathetic to them. So that that kind of concerted level of effort is no longer really happening across the board. And that means keeping those numbers as low as they have to be to have the desired effect on reducing predation is now really hard to do at the landscape level. So what we can ask is, you know, the simple version of the story is, yes, if you got rid of all the predators, the landscape would be safer for sheep. But can that be done in the world that we live in now with the laws and culture that exists now? Probably not.
So
and should it be done for the health of the ecosystem? Well, that's a bigger question because, like I mentioned, we know that large carnivores do play a role in ecosystem health, and so that's a kind of separate concern. So it just depends on your sense of priority and
but
we can get into that.
Well, it's interesting because that's just where I was hoping to go for a few minutes, maybe. This is the Ecology Hour, and so far in the program, we haven't actually considered the role that these carnivores may have in the ecosystem. So can you help us understand a little bit about how they actually do help us in Mendocino County to have healthy ecosystems?
Yeah, I can. You know, healthy ecosystem is a hard concept to define, but when we talk about that as ecologists, a lot of what we point to is this concept of the trophic cascade. And that sounds like one of these big, fancy, academic, jargony words or phrases, but the concept is really pretty simple. So imagine you have an ecosystem that has mountain lions, deer, and grass. And those are the only three things that are living there. So if you have all three of them together, the mountain lions would be eating the deer would be eating the grass, and so the mountain lions, by limiting the population size of deer, would actually help the grass grow to a certain extent in this really simple example. But if you remove the mountain lions, all of a sudden you might have an explosion in the population of deer who would chomp down all the grass, and you might get an ecosystem that suddenly looks very different than it did without the large predators. So that's a really simple example. So when we have just a mountain lion, a deer, and grass in our system, we can call each of these levels of the food chain. You can imagine it as a chain, right? The deer eating the grass, the mountain lions eating the deer, and each link in this chain is called a trophic level. And trophic just means energy, so it's kind of an energy level. You've got grass that are producing energy, deer that are eating that primary production, and mountain lions that are eating the deer. So each one is an energy level, and when you remove a mountain lion, the effects of that removal cascade down these energy levels, hence the name trophic cascade. It can get even more complicated when you have medium-sized predators that are also in the mix. And to make a long story short, medium-sized predators, which we call mesopredators, often eat a huge variety of things, and when they are not subjected to competition or predation or intimidation by large predators, their numbers can get really out of hand, and that can really have harmful effects on the diversity of the system, just because these mesopredators will eat a whole bunch of stuff and cause problems that way. So there's been a ton of science in the last 50, 60 years that's demonstrated the really powerful effects of these trophic cascades around the world. They seem to be present in any system, and we see it very frequently that when you remove a large predator from a system, the effects don't just matter for that animal or the prey species of that animal, but they cascade through the entire ecosystem in which it lives. So in that sense, yeah, the science that's been done around this has really demonstrated the importance of these large predators to the entire ecosystems that they inhabit.
Excellent. Thank you so much for giving us an overview of that. Now, Alex, I know you've been studying in this area specifically for a number of years now. Would you mind giving us a little bit of your background and how it relates to this particular issue?
Yeah, sometimes I feel like what I've been studying is the California Fish and Wildlife permitting process to try to get our research up and running. But understandably, when you want to work with large animals and large carnivores in particular, it's important to do things right. And so we're getting close to actually doing some of the carnivore science I think we're getting close to doing some of the carnivore science that we hope to do with them in terms of collaring large animals. Fingers crossed. But in the meantime, we've been putting a lot of GPS collars on deer. And these collars basically transmit a GPS point, so a location on the map of the deer once every hour. And we've been collecting all kinds of data on deer to try to estimate their population sizes. And this is really important. I mean, anyone who hunts knows that having accurate population sizes of deer is really important to their management. Anyone who has a little garden in their backyard knows that getting a good count of deer is important to managing them, to reduce the amount of conflict that happens between deer and the things they like to eat. So that's been a huge emphasis for our research and for the state of California, but it also forms the basis. Deer are one of the most important prey species for the large carnivores in the state, mountain lions, black bears, and coyotes in our neck of the woods in Mendocino County. So having that baseline information about their movement, their population size, is really setting us up well to better understand the carnivore ecology.
Thank you for.
We've also done some work on conflict between predators and livestock producers at the Hopland Research and Extension Center, and we've been trying to map out where conflict occurs, what kind of environmental features are most predictive of where that conflict occurs, and we've also been working directly with the staff at the center to try to understand their experience and perceptions about what areas are risky, why they make the decisions that they make, and how we can kind of use the science and statistics and data modeling that we do and combine it with the experience and understanding that they have intuitively of the landscape to try to do a better job of reducing losses without having to rely on lethal methods of controlling the carnivores.
That sounds like a very complicated and fascinating way to come at this issue. I'm guessing it's not easy for you in a couple of sentences to give us your findings of that, is it?
It is and it isn't. I mean, we can make it as complicated as we want, but I think the key takeaway to me is that the issues that come up between predators and livestock are not strictly ecological, and they're not strictly human. And so to really do a good job as scientists, and especially as scientists who want to contribute something to the management of livestock and management that reduces the amount of lethal control of predators, but while also helping protect people's flocks, if those are our goals, then basically what we found is that it's really important to include producers in these conversations and to kind of iteratively share what we learn from the data that we analyze with the producers, get their feedback on it, incorporate it back into what we do, So we try to be really humble as far as our science and say, our science is only as good as our understanding of both the landscape itself and the people. And it's only as good as their willingness to listen to us, too. So, yeah, we really believe that it's a collaborative science and a collaborative process, and have tried to find ways to actually make that real in the science that we do.
Alex, obviously we could be talking for a very long period about the complexities of this situation. Unfortunately today, I think that's all we have time for. I hope you'll be able to join us again on a program in the near future, perhaps when you have got to the end of the PhD, which I know is very, very soon now. We'd love to hear where you're at that point.
Well, Hannah, I'd be delighted. We can and we should talk all day about it, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Well, thank you so much to Alex and to all of our contributors on this evening's Ecology Hour. I'm sure you'll agree that it's an incredibly complex subject, and it's one which deserves for all of the voices to be heard at the table, for us to make a decision which is appropriate. There are a number of resources that you may wish to look into after listening to tonight's show. We started off speaking with Devin Jones of the Mendocino County Farm Bureau, and you can find their website at mendofb.org. We then had a conversation with Camilla Fox of Project Coyote, and you can find the Project Coyote website at projectcoyote.org. You will also find a link there for the upcoming meeting in Casper on September 18th. Following that, we had a conversation with Kyle Farmer from the Magruder Ranch, and you can find out more about the Magruder Ranch at magruderranch.com. Of course, you can always visit the Hopland Research and Extension Centre website as well, where we hope to have events that will be aligned with this topic and allow you to have further time to have a conversation and think about it. The Hopland Research and Extension Centre website is hrec.ucanr.edu. You'll also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I do encourage you to take a look on one of those, your preferred one of those, because we will follow up on this subject on our social media channels in the near future. Thanks for listening to the Ecology Hour this evening.